A little while back I made a video about what I've learned from 4 years as a wannabe YouTuber. It occurred to me later that I'd forgotten to mention one important lesson that I've learned from making a whole heap of videos about games, both old and new. And yes, I promise this is relevant to Story of Thor 2. A little bit, at least. The lesson I neglected to mention is this. Making YouTube videos about gaming may end up changing the way you approach the games you play, and in a couple of different ways. First, it may change the games you decide to devote your time to. 5 years ago, I played whatever happened to pique my interest at any given moment. Now, whenever I consider whether I want to play a particular game, a significant part of my thought process is dedicated to figuring out whether I can maybe use it as the basis for a video. If the answer is no, well, that doesn't necessarily mean I won't bother playing the game, but it has been the deciding factor in quite a few cases. This is kind of ironic in light of the fact that one of my stated aims in starting a YouTube channel was to motivate me to play a bunch of different games. And, well, it's done that, but I didn't realise how strong a demotivating factor it would be for other games. That's how making YouTube videos has changed how I choose which games to play, but the other change relates to how I play them once the choice has been made, and it was particularly apparent to me while I was playing through Story of Thor 2. You see, it's an excellent game, a well-designed and enjoyable adventure that matches my particular tastes. But it's also quite confusing at times and demands patience and thoughtfulness to navigate its sprawling, complex dungeons, and that was a problem for me. Not because I'm thoughtless and impatient and easily confused, well, not just because of those things, but more because playing the game had become just one part of the process of making a video, rather than something I was doing just to have fun. Now, I was still having fun, as I have fun when I play all the games I make videos about, most of them anyway, but I was also thinking about how I wanted to kind of get it over with so I could continue the process that will, barring catastrophe, result in a new addition to my YouTube catalogue. That thought is present whenever I play a game specifically for a video, but because Story of Thor 2 is such a good game, and because of the way it often forced me to spend time in exploration rather than progression, the way my mindset prevented me from truly enjoying the game was particularly notable. In the past, I've spent many hours playing Elden Ring, for example, just exploring its world without making any real progress, and that never bothered me at all, because I wasn't playing it with a video in mind. I did end up making a brief video about that game, but that was just a general discussion of my thoughts and feelings on Elden Ring rather than a pre-planned run-through of everything the game had to offer. And I know that I would have enjoyed Story of Thor 2 in much the same way if I had played it back when it was new and I was just playing it for the game itself. I would have happily spent hours exploring every nook and cranny, rather than experiencing a pang of impatience every time I found my path blocked and needed to cast around for a solution, and that happened a lot. But that's a me problem. For now, let's take a more objective look at the Story of Thor 2. And yes, like the first in the series, this one had a different name in the US, in this case The Legend of Oasis, but the copy I own is called The Story of Thor 2, so that's what I'll be using. Yes, I actually own a copy of this game. It is literally the only Saturn game in my collection. And you know what? I've never actually played it until this week. And even now, I won't be playing this on original hardware. I do own a Saturn, but it's somewhere in storage and hasn't been turned on for about 2 decades. And even then, I just turned it on to verify it functioned, so who knows if it still works. Plus, I don't have the equipment to record stuff from a Saturn, so emulation it is. I promise not to abuse the save states. Not too much anyway. So yes, this is a Saturn game, the first one I've featured on my channel, and indeed the first one I've ever played. When the Saturn was first announced, as a massive Sega fanboy, I was incredibly excited, and was absolutely sure it was destined for greatness, unlike the Sony PlayStation. I mean, what kind of name was that? PlayStation? It sounded like one of those plastic activity stations for toddlers. The Saturn would grind this upstart into dust, I was sure of it. Well, by the time I had saved up enough pocket money to afford a 32-bit console, even a die-hard Sega fan like me had to admit the PlayStation had won the war, so that's where my money went. When I finally did get a Saturn years later, it seemed like more of a novelty, a bizarre curio of eras past. Games were tough to find, and the only one I really wanted was Panzer Dragoon Saga, which sold for astronomical prices. Or at least they seemed astronomical then. Recent trends in retro gaming markets mean it's more inaccessible than ever. But I did come across a relatively inexpensive copy of Story of Thor 2, and I never played it. I'm not sure why. The fact it was a sequel to a game I'd always wanted to play might have been a factor, as I like to play things in order if possible. Well, if you saw my last video, you know I've now played the Story of Thor, so I'm finally ready to dive into the sequel. After I say one last thing, I really do recommend you watch that last video of mine, and not just because I'm desperate to get my view counts up. The thing is, this really is a continuation of that first game. Well, in gameplay terms it is. Story-wise, it's not so much of a continuation. But all the fundamental concepts and elements were established in the first game, and one of the most interesting things about Story of Thor 2 is the way it builds and expands on those elements, because it sure does a lot of building and expanding. So the game starts, much like the first, in a peaceful village, where Leon is given the golden armlet and told his powers mark him as the next king of spirits. And now, also like the first game, he must go and find the water spirit Ditto. No, not that one. And yes, I did that joke last time. If the game can't be bothered coming up with new plot points, neither can I. Ultimately, the first game's story was minimal, and this one's story is only very slightly less so. It's all just a shallow pretext to get you out in the world, delving through dungeons and acquiring new powers, and honestly that's fine, it's really all that's needed. So you set out to find Ditto, who conveniently resides underneath your hometown. The basic gameplay is almost identical to the first game. You can dash, jump, perform basic attacks, or hold down the button for something stronger. The special moves also return, the 360-degree slash which was so useful in the first game, and the combo activated by pressing forward, back, forward, and then the attack button. I barely used that one in the first game, but I realised pretty early on in Story of Thor 2 that this combo attack is massively useful. In fact, it may be genuinely overpowered, and I barely used anything else when it came to combat. You get a bow early on, and this is one of the few major changes between games. In the first game, your only permanent weapon was your basic knife, and any other weapon you found could only be used a limited number of times. This time around you can acquire several different weapons that can all be used at will. In practice though, this isn't a major change. You can only use that overpowered combo attack I mentioned before with the knife, so that's the weapon I stuck with for almost all the combat. The other weapons were really only useful for solving puzzles. Well, I say only, but puzzle solving is really at the core of Story of Thor 2. I criticised the first game for its fairly basic and occasionally irritating puzzles. Well, the developers must have heard me somehow, nearly 30 years in the future, because the puzzles here are vastly more interesting and complex. They are still occasionally irritating though. That said, the first dungeon is pretty straightforward, although even this is a step up from most of the first game in terms of sophistication and complexity. You can aim upwards with your bow to hit things out of reach, you can move boulders and other objects to act as stepping stones, you can shoot arrows through fire to flip switches. These are some solid foundations for good environmental puzzles, and the game will make frequent use of them throughout its runtime. The first boss appears before too long, and it's a nice gentle introduction to the sort of boss fights the game has in store. I hadn't yet realised the power of the knife's combo attack, so I just used the bow to whittle him down, and despite getting hit unnecessarily way too many times, I managed to empty his health bar before he could do the same to mine. In some ways the combat in this sequel is actually easier than it was in the first game. In part this is due to the knife's ability to melt enemy health bars, but I would say that on the whole enemies do less damage and are generally less threatening, at least until the very final areas. The vast majority of my reloaded save states were due to falling off things. I think I only died to actual enemies a few times towards the end of the game. I should point out though that there are difficulty settings in this game, something I didn't realise until after I'd finished it, so I guess I played on the default difficulty. I did later have a go at the hardest difficulty, and it seriously ramps up the damage you take, so it's possible to make the combat much harder than the first game, if that's what you want for some reason. So you find Ditto, the water spirit. The summons work basically the same as they did in the first game. To briefly recap though, to summon a spirit you need to fire an energy ball from your armlet into a matching element of the environment. For Ditto that means water. Each summon has a couple of abilities that can be useful in combat or puzzle solving, or both of those things, but these abilities, and indeed just having a summon active, drains your magic bar. And recovery of both your magic and health bar is another thing that's handled a bit differently in this sequel. You no longer have an inventory that can hold various recovery items. Instead you can hold just one potion that you can't actually use at will, but which will activate automatically on reaching 0 health. Enemies still occasionally drop recovery items, but if they're of no immediate use to you, they're essentially wasted. The game balances this out a bit by scattering healing runes throughout the game which will recover health or magic, or both, while you're standing on them. This system works okay. Health is rarely too much of an issue, but there were a few occasions where I found myself completely out of magic, and unlike the first game, it doesn't automatically regenerate when you don't have a summon active. I don't think this was a great decision, as it doesn't really make the game any more difficult or intricate, it just makes it a bit of a pain in the ass when you have to trudge back several rooms to a place where you can get back some more magic points. Anyway, now you've acquired the ability to summon Tito, it's time to go find Defreet. No, not that one. Yep, once again, I repeated the joke from the last video to match the repeated quest structure from the first game. You now get to step outside of your village for the first time. It wouldn't be entirely accurate to call this an open world game, but there is a relatively large, non-linear space to explore at your leisure. Likewise, it wouldn't be entirely accurate to call this a Metroidvania game, but like games of that style, there are plenty of interactable objects around that you have not yet unlocked the ability to activate, and which encourage you to come back later and see what you've missed out on. I suppose, actually, this open world area is only large in comparison to the first game. By the 32-bit era, other games were maybe pushing those boundaries a little bit more. But it is intricate and well designed, if a little confusing at times, and it's not always clear where exactly you need to go next. That's not too much of an issue yet though, as the way to Efreet's hideout is literally signposted. This place is a bit of a step up in complexity and difficulty, but not too much of one. The learning curve of the game is actually really good, as each dungeon feels like a fresh challenge and new abilities are learned at a slow but steady pace, giving you adequate time to learn where and when you're expected to use each of them. Here, for instance, you'll acquire the Blue Rod, a weapon which I found to be inferior to the knife in every way, but which does allow you to destroy dead trees and, with upgrades found along the journey, do a few other vital things as well. There is some platforming here, and if you watched my first video on the first game, you'll know this was probably the most painfully frustrating element of the Story of Thor. Fortunately, I would say it's handled significantly better here. It's not that it's any easier as such, and actually it can still be kind of frustrating at times, but mostly the platforming sections are just designed better. They flow together better, it's not quite as easy to slip off, and it's rarer that enemies will be able to knock you down. That said, the penalties for falling off can be harsh, as there are occasions where you'll fall down a very large distance indeed. In fact, there's a new focus on verticality in this sequel that was somewhat controversial in the contemporary reviews I was able to track down. I compared the first game to Landstalker on the Mega Drive, although I still think it's not a great comparison, it's just what was at the forefront of my mind. This second game though definitely shares one element with Landstalker, and that's the difficulty of clearly displaying height differences in an environment that's rendered in 2 dimensions. Personally though, it was something I learned to adapt to in Landstalker, and the same was true here. Yes, it's undeniably awkward at times, and there were plenty of occasions where I missed a jump or fell to somewhere I couldn't climb back from because I misjudged the height of a platform. And sometimes the way forward was made more difficult to find, because it wasn't always clear what was a height you could jump to and what was impossible to reach. But once I became accustomed to the way the game was designed, it really wasn't much more than a minor and occasional irritation. The thing is, the designers made clear efforts to alleviate what irritation there was. Floors on the same level tend to be shaded the same way, and the darker they get, the lower they are. Also, objects cast shadows that clearly indicate what plane they are on, which can be very handy. In any case, it's not too arduous a journey to get to Efreet, and the boss fight beforehand isn't much of a challenge, at least not now I'd learned the true power of the knife combo, and had Ditto trailing behind me throwing out the heals. I could pretty much ignore the boss's damage. Well, up to a point. Once my magic ran out and my healing dried up, I actually took enough damage to require a healing potion, but mainly that's down to the fact I kept running headfirst into a boss adorned with giant spikes. He's the one who died first, so who looks stupidest? It's still me, isn't it? So now we have Efreet, who may actually be the least useful of the summons. I rarely used him in combat, and although he can be used to light torches to open hidden pathways, this can also be done with bombs, which unlike the last game are plentiful. But hey, it's good to have him along for the ride, I guess. Back to the village I go, and what's this? Plot development? Well yes, but plot development of the most minor and vague sort. An injured woman has shown up and needs healing, which Ditto provides. But apparently that's not enough, so we need to find the spirit of the earth, which, you know, is what I was supposed to be doing anyway. So it's off to the forest. And okay, now things are starting to pick up difficulty-wise. This was the first place where I really needed to start making a concerted effort to keep a mental map of the layout in my brain, and given how feeble my brain is these days, doing so was painful. And also inaccurate. This is where I started to spend more time wondering where to go next than actually going there. It is quite a complex environment though. There are caves below and densely forested areas above, and various pits that you can fall down that take you to new locations. Well, sometimes they do, other times they just take you back to places you've already been before. There are several keys that unlock several doors, and actually if I was going to explain the experience of playing this game as simply as possible, I'd describe it as mostly either looking for a key to unlock the door you've just found, or looking for a door to unlock with the key you've just found. Seriously, the most joy I had in this game didn't come from defeating any of the bosses or acquiring a new ability. It came when I found the various distinctive black and gold chests that hold keys, because they are hidden well and sometimes with great cunning. I said in my review of the first game that it walked a fine line between giving you locations that are fun and challenging to explore and ones that are confusing and irritating to find your way through, but that it stayed on the right side of that line almost all the time. The same is true here, except that everything has been expanded and really taken to the next level. So the fun and challenge are significantly increased, but the confusion and irritation are likewise magnified. However, since it almost always stays on the right side of the line between those elements, the result is an experience that is a net gain over the original, and a truly great game in my opinion. And it's important to remember that a lot of the irritation I did feel was really down to the reasons I outlined earlier. I'm sure I would have had moments of annoyance and impatience even if I wasn't playing the game for YouTube reasons, but they would have passed much more quickly. Anyway, we get a new ability here, and it's one of the first and most important of several weapon power-ups that are new to the sequel. Finding certain scrolls lets you imbue one of your weapons with a particular ability, although there are complications. You need to find orbs of the correct type out in the environment to charge your weapon, and you only get a certain number of charges. If you find more scrolls of the same type, you can increase the number of charges, and if you find enough of the gems that let your summons gain levels, they might eventually acquire the ability to let you charge your weapons without needing to find the orbs. Yeah, it's complicated, and you don't really need to understand it. Basically, these are all just elements that the game combines in various different ways to create the many and varied puzzles. And as you might be able to imagine, the more of these elements you unlock, the greater the complexity of the puzzles becomes. Anyway, this ability lets you use your rod to grant purification, as the actress said to the bishop. What this means is you can make springs sprout from certain plants, allowing you to jump up to new areas, and also briefly resurrect skeletons lying on the ground, some of whom will offer advice or open up new pathways. It's actually pretty cool, as some of the human remains lying around that I'd assumed were just part of the background turned out to be vital to finding secret areas. So yes, this whole place took me quite a while to traverse, at least twice as long as either of the previous dungeons, and probably more, but I eventually made it to the boss. Which was pretty damn easy, as I once again just whacked it over and over with the knife. And actually, having said earlier that Ifrit wasn't particularly useful, he did come in handy here, as his area of effect attack was pretty handy for taking down all the bees. And so we become reacquainted with our old friend, the piranha plant from the Mario series, or Bawu as is known here. He's another summon who's kind of limited in combat but is absolutely crucial for his other abilities. He can swallow large objects, which is necessary for unblocking vital pathways, and perhaps more significantly he can open up the cracks in the ground which are located all over the place. These are rarely needed to make progress, but they are the key to any number of secrets and bonus items, and hunting them down and seeing what they do is a fun and satisfying part of the game. Meanwhile, back in the village, more plot is happening. Myra, the injured girl, can now be woken, and she has some exposition to give. Darkness pervading the world, the rise of Agito who bears the silver armlet, blah blah blah. Agito was the protagonist of the first game, but is still not exactly what you'd call a well-developed villain. The plot of this sequel is a little more fleshed out than the original, but it's still paper thin and eminently ignorable. So ignore it I did, apart from the hint about where my next target is. We're about a third of the way through the game now, and by this point all the fundamental elements are in place, and hopefully I've gone some way towards explaining how they come together to create a really rather cool adventure game experience. So I'll touch more lightly on all the stuff that happens between now and the final stages of the game, even though it kept me occupied and entertained for quite a few hours. There are 3 more summons to be found, one of which is the Shadow from the first game, but the other 2 are new. The first of these is Brass, the Spirit of Sound. He's a sort of weird combination dragon/trumpet, which is a design choice I have to admit I love. His abilities are perhaps not quite as interesting though, as they really just allow you to destroy the crystals that block your paths in places, and are really functionally the same as the several other abilities that let you destroy various other obstacles. The other new spirit, and the last one you find in this game, is Elle. She is, and there's no delicate way of putting this, a sexy cloud. She's also incredibly useful. She has electric powers that can activate various control panels and robots, and more importantly, you can glide through the air on her back. This opens up all manner of new areas, but is also maybe the element that most effectively demonstrates the problems with depicting different heights in the 2D game. She can glide, but she can't rise up, and in fact she slowly falls as she moves through the air. So if you try to fly to a location that's too high for you, you probably won't even make it back to where you started, since you'll have fallen at least a little bit by then. It can be an annoyance, but I never found it to be a game-breaking one. I do need to admit, however, that on a few occasions when I missed my target I reloaded a save state, rather than take the time to walk back to where I started. In my defense, depending on where I fell to, some of those walks would have been pretty damn lengthy. Anyway, all these spirits have dungeons associated with them, and each of the dungeons has a boss. As before, none of the bosses were really challenging, and all of the dungeons grew increasingly more complex and difficult to navigate, but consistently impressed me with their intelligent design and the way they engaged my brain without ever completely overwhelming it. Well, with a couple of exceptions, I guess. I tried my utmost to avoid looking at any guides or walkthroughs, but on 2 occasions my patience ran out and I succumbed to the temptation. And on the first occasion it turned out that I need not have bothered, as I had all the items and abilities required. I just hadn't realised that I needed to whack a certain object with my sword in a particular way to destroy it. The second occasion was right near the end when I had acquired the 3 cubes needed to access the final dungeon, and no, don't ask me why I needed those cubes, the plot remains vague and forgettable all the way through the game. I just could not figure out where exactly I was supposed to go next, and I didn't fancy spending potentially several hours traipsing around the entire game world trying to figure it out. So I looked at a walkthrough, and the answer was just that I needed to go to the room pretty much right next to where I was, with a clear pathway to the next area, but which I had somehow completely forgotten about. I honestly think my brain had reached the limit of how much virtual geography it could hold. And really, I can't even blame it. The entire final section of the game is a truly vast and varied stronghold of devious puzzles and deadly monsters. Yes, finally the enemies are posing more of a threat. They still die fairly quickly to the knife combo, but they now attack quicker and hit harder. And they're still much less of a threat than the environment is. It's so easy to get lost. There's some truly Dark Souls-esque complexity here, and I think it's made all the harder to navigate due to the top-down perspective, which makes it a little tougher to get a real sense of space and place. The whole final dungeon takes place right back where you started the game, underneath your village, which is a trope I really like in games for some reason. It all ends where it began. It's a cliche, but I find it cool. The very final section is a kind of boss rush, as 3 of the big bad's lackeys take you on. The first of them succumbs quickly to the ever-useful knife combo. The second dies slightly less quickly to the knife combo. The third teleports around and summons annoying clones, and then dies quickly to the knife combo. And then it's final boss time. As you can possibly tell, the bosses so far have been a little disappointing, if only because of how damn overpowered that combo is. In truth, they've been quite interesting and well designed, but that hasn't mattered much as I just press the same buttons over and over. Fortunately, the final boss manages to be a little more engaging. In fact, I even died to it once. It's an interesting setup. It launches a heap of different projectiles, most of which give you an opportunity to summon a particular spirit if you hit them with your armlet bolt. However, if you have any given summon active for long enough, the boss becomes invulnerable until you dismiss it, and you have to switch things up regularly. Or you can do what I did on my first attempt and just forgo the summoning altogether and attempt to brute force the encounter with, you guessed it, the knife combo. And I came near as damn it to managing it too. Second time around, I approached the encounter in the way intended. I realised that the game was strongly hinting I should take Earl, the sexy cloud, into the boss fight, and doing so lets her create a circle on the ground that you can use to infinitely replenish your magic. So you can use your summons abilities pretty much at will, assuming the boss fires the projectiles you need to summon the one you want. I don't know if it's random or what, but when I was desperately low on health, he just would not give me a water projectile, so I could summon Ditto and use her healing magic. So I just powered through with a good old knife combo after all, and won with just a sliver of health remaining. Oh well, a win's a win. Hooray, game complete. Maya is released because she was held under the boss's power and had been made to fight for him or something, and I guess she's in love with Leon. Who the hell is Leon? Oh yeah, he's the guy you play as. Like I say, the story is ignorable, and I guess I ignored it. I'm not even sure that the final reveal that this is actually a prequel to the first game rather than the sequel is a reveal, or it's something I should have known already. It really doesn't matter. Because ultimately, this truly is a superb game, and it stands out in my mind as a particularly great sequel, or prequel, whatever, as it takes everything that was great about the first game and just makes it so much better. I was kind of surprised, therefore, to read that Story of Thor 2 wasn't received as well as the first game, but I guess it's all to do with perspective. I played it just a week after playing the Mega Drive game, so it's very easy for me to see the objective improvements. Back then though, the sequel came years later and was part of the revolutionary new 32-bit era, so I guess it's natural that reviewers at the time were inclined to compare it to other games on the Saturn and PlayStation. Even so, I really do think it's a standout game of the generation and deserves to still be played today. It's perhaps a little unrefined compared to the many excellent and varied indie platformers and Metroidvanias of today, and maybe not as user-friendly in some ways, but those ways are also part of what makes the game so interesting to play. Most modern games of this style would have some form of in-game map or waypoint system, but the lack of one just means you have to engage with the game world more. You have to really keep your mind on where you are and where you've been and where you need to get to. I try not to be one of those doddering old men who insists that everything was better back in my day, but this is perhaps one element that's less common in modern gaming. Fortunately, we have Soulsborne games and a few others that share these design sensibilities. Anyway, all I really need to say is I had a lot of fun with Story of Thor 2, and I say that even with my YouTuber hat on. As just a gamer, it's even more fantastic. Well, thanks for watching. I hope... Oh crap, I've forgotten the music again. Like the first game, the music in Story of Thor 2 was composed by industry legend Yuzo Koshiro, so why has it slipped under my radar once again? Well, this time it's actually because of just how unobtrusive it is. I'm honestly not sure if it was an emulation issue or what, but the music was so low in the mix that I really had to strain to hear it most of the time. And when I could hear it, it was, I don't know, basically fine I guess. Atmospheric rather than dramatic and not very memorable. Oh well. Right, thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, etc. if the mood takes you. Until next time though, get off my lawn.